it was initiated as a journal in the University of Glasgow. Glasgow, of course, is in the west of Scotland, is in one of the areas which was most notable for its economic decline. The city itself had all sorts of problems that public policy was attending to. The university then, through the initiative of a particular professor, Donald Robertson, set up a unique department indeed for those times, a research department called Department of Social and Economic Research, which didn't just look at urban questions but looked at management, labour issues and so forth. And as part of that, it was decided that as there wasn't really a journal at that time that looked at urban and regional issues in the sort of way that was envisaged, that a journal was appropriate. So the journal was set up, and the articles were a mix very much of academic articles and policy articles indeed in the early days. I mean, if you look back at the very first issues of Urban Studies, you'd probably say, yes, it's certainly very British. There were a number of articles specifically on Scotland, but also in those early articles ventured into Europe. And I think in the second and third issue, it had begun to look at things across the Atlantic in North America. The theoretical issues mainly were geared up around the idea of how the state could intervene in a positive sense to bring about greater economic growth. So growth pole theory, for example, was very much in vogue in the 1960s, and that occupied certainly people's minds in a number of articles. There were questions about congestion and problems of overconcentration, regional imbalance. As a result of major shifts that were going out in the wider world, that there was a flowering, or beginning of the flowering of what we call urban studies, and the journal reflected that in some ways. Of course, Lefebvre himself wasn't really translated into English until the 1990s, so it took quite a time for him to percolate through. But yes, by the time we got into 1970s, then we were beginning to become more critical. It wasn't just a question of, say, if we took an issue like segregation, then it wasn't a question of just doing a factorial ecology type analysis to look at how different social groups were divided in the city, but to stand back and begin to ask questions, bigger questions in relation to segregation. Of course, by that time, we'd had the race riots in North America, and so those clearly did raise those kinds of broader issues. The move towards more critical and theoretically informed articles was gradual, I would say, and was influenced by a number of turns that were happening out there in the wider world, academic and also political academic, in the sense that quite clearly there was a move towards Marxist forms of analysis in the 1970s and a critical turn and so forth. The journal itself has become multidisciplinary. I mean, if you're dealing with the city, then you need to be aware of looking beyond the fences that are created by the different disciplines through which we normally undertake higher education. So in other words, the economic needs to be aware of the social and so forth. The content of it is multidisciplinary. If you looked at the way in which the journal it publishes in its special issues, you'd see that some were certainly rooted in questions of, for example, housing, of economic development, of governance, of ones that are closer to the cultural turn as it manifests itself in different ways within the city. We have a special issue coming out about the geography of the urban night, for example. So it's multidisciplinary. It's also interdisciplinary, and many articles actually reflect that. So if you were to ask me what particular ways it's going to develop in the future, then in a way, it's going to extrapolate from the position that it's in, and there are particular, because it's already a very strong journal in terms of the interdisciplinarity of much of the content, and the awareness that the urban is something that cuts across disciplinary boundaries. Having said that, then I think there are certainly going to be a number of issues that arise in relation to the future, which I certainly would like the journal to take greater account of. One is an historical dimension. I don't necessarily mean going back 100, 200 years, but the recent past, the fairly recent past, the last 50, 80 years, that sort of time scale, needs to be brought in and understood much more within our analysis, both theoretical and also empirical. I think you need to really ask yourself a certain number of key questions. One is, what original am I contributing to the literature? There must be a sense in the paper that you're adding in some way. Theoretically, yes, definitely, but also empirically. Within the contribution, and you should flag that. In other words, don't be shy at that point. Say this is what where there's a gap in the literature, and this is where the Article 10 is going to attend to, and that is possibly really the most important point, because obviously academic journals and urban studies is no exception, wish to take the agenda forward. They don't want to stand still with it. And so the emphasis on novelty and academic novelty within the article is all important. And I'd certainly, though, encourage, particularly as young researchers that have the task of needing to make a mark for themselves in the academic world, so their need for establishing themselves in key academic journals is certainly there. I'd certainly encourage them to do that. And